You know, I am Randy's friend. I'm also an attorney. I don't practice anymore, but I'm still licensed. And he mentioned before he spoke a little bit about his experience, and he is a known quantity to a lot of you because he's on freedom team, right? And I'm not. I've never been on a podcast in my life. But I am right now. No. That's good. Then I'm being a podcast virgin today. And I'm not going to be nervous about it. I started out in life not as an attorney, but as a police officer. I spent 7 years as a peace officer, and then I went to law school, and I spent another 7 years as an assistant attorney general for the state of Missouri. And then I went into line prosecution. I was a county prosecutor in a large county with a small population in Missouri, Callaway County. And at the close of my prosecutorial time there, I also, because I was young still, 41, and I wanted to get back to that little bit of excitement that I had when I was a police officer. And so I was a reserve police officer while being a prosecutor in the city of Columbia in the early 2000s. So I have a lot of experience about being a police officer, and I just want to make a couple of comments about what Randy talked about. There's just one single rule that's almost more important than anything else, and it's one of the two he talked about. Yes, don't consent to searches. Don't consent to anything if you can avoid it. Don't resist, but don't consent. And the other thing is, close your mouth. There is nothing you can say that's going to make your life better. All right? And I want to talk about a couple of specific instances where people say things because the police officer is sitting there with a clipboard and a report. And specifically, it's in DWIs. They ask you a whole lot of questions about what you're doing and what you've been doing that evening. Every one of those is not good for you. There is no question you can answer about what you've been doing after you've been drinking and driving that's going to make your life better. Keep your mouth shut. He has to give you the Miranda warning before he asks those questions on that form, but don't do anything but say, I'd like to avail myself of my Fifth Amendment right and not speak to you. Now, the only things that you really have to tell a police officer are your name, other identifying information which is reasonable, which means in our world probably your date of birth, and your address. And the only reason you have to give those is because the police officer has to ensure the courts that they can find you later. And if they can't find you later, if you're not going to give your name, your date of birth, and where you live, you will not get out of jail. You will not have an opportunity to post bond. You will stay there until you appear in front of a judge and assure the judge of who you are and where you can be found. Everything else, no, don't talk. Everything else, just your name, your date of birth, and where you live. Of course, I'm not up here to give Randy speak, but I thought I'd add a little bit from my experience. What I'm up here to talk about is the federal firearms law. And I brought along something to help me out. I brought this along as an aid, a visual aid. This is a Roman gladius. Rome was the first regulatory state that essentially controlled the world. They ruled everywhere where civilization was. They made the world Rome. And they made the world Rome with this, the gladius, the Spanish sword. It's called the Spanish sword because they stole it from Spain. They were truly empire builders. And this was the way they did it, with force and violence. The other reason I brought this along is because this is plastic. This is the kind of weapon our regulatory state would like you to have. A plastic sword. They want to have the steel sword because they want to have a monopoly of force. And when I talk about the regulatory state, I mean the federal government and I mean all the states. But I'm only going to talk about the federal government today because that's the only one I can rationally talk to you about in the space of about 30 minutes. If I were to try to tell you about the laws of each and every one of the several states, I would be here for 3 hours, and I would probably get most of it wrong. One of the reasons for that is the way the Constitution is set up as a federated republic. That means that each of the states has their own police power, and they can police with regard to weapons. And before the federal government started enacting legislation about weapons, it was the states that had regulations about weapons. My own state prohibited the concealed carry of firearms long before anyone ever thought about it, and that was mostly because of the post-Civil War violence in Missouri. If you remember from both history and Hollywood, Jesse James was a robber and a highwayman and a train stopper. Okay. He did that with force of arms. Well, part of the reason why Missouri has its prohibition about concealed carry, or did, and it had an absolute prohibition against concealed carry for a long time, and the reason it had it was because Missouri was considered to be bloody Missouri, a place where there were brigands and criminals and everything else, and you couldn't go about the streets without somebody robbing. Reaction of the state was to prohibit weapons. And up until about the 1920s, that was the only place you had to worry about. You only had to worry about your state, your city. And even in the Old West, cities prohibited to carry weapons on the streets. Dodge City did. Tombstone did. So, how did the federal government become involved? Well, the first federal legislation with regard to weapons was in the 1930s. And again, that was in response to perceived criminality. We're talking about Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, those people. We've all seen the movies about them. It's been blown up and made to be kind of an urban myth and fantasy. Well, it wasn't so much of an urban myth because Clyde Barrow was known for a sawed-off, fully automatic BAR, Browning automatic rifle, that you could fit under a coat. And it was the first time that criminals in the United States had two things, one of which was access to military firearms, and because you could buy them anywhere. I mean, Colt sold their machine guns with advertisements of cowboys on the back of horses with a Tommy gun. And that was in the 1920s. You could buy one, you could write the company, send them a check, and they'd send you the gun. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was automobiles. Criminals had automobiles, and they went multi-state. So it was perceived that the states could not handle it, and the federal government stepped in. Now, one of the other issues that comes out in the 30s is that was pretty much the I won't say the height of, but the beginning of the death of constitutional prohibitions on the regulations passed by Congress, the laws Congress could enact. Originally, the Constitution, as you know, was drafted so that the federal government was supposed to be weak and that there was a limited power. Well, no. In the 30s, those things slowly went away. And they went away both in the National Firearms Act and also in some other regulatory acts, specifically regarding grain, the growing of grain. Anyone familiar with that case? Heard about it? I gotta look at my notes to get the name.
Wickard v. Filburn?
Yes, Wickard v. Filburn. Thank you for reminding me. That's a case where the Supreme Court said that if you grew grain on your own property for your own consumption, the consumption of your family, so that it went out of the ground in your mouth, back through your body, and into your septic system, that the fact that you grew that grain affected interstate commerce and allowed the federal government to regulate it. Now, I got to tell you, when I first read that case in law school, I thought to myself, who are you kidding? This is so convoluted. This is so ridiculous. It's just a mechanism, a rhetorical mechanism, so that the federal government could grab power and do things it shouldn't do. Yep. Well, I think the only case that did not affirm Congress's almost unlimited Commerce Clause power that we've heard of in the last 30 years was the guns near schools. They came up with a no Commerce Clause power to do that, which stunned everybody who had any kind of interest in what the Supreme Court did, because it was so outside of what their record was. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Get back to the 1930s. 1930s, we had the National Firearms Act, the NFA. And that created the first scheme of regulating weapons. Basically, it did so by the use of a tax stamp. You could still have the prohibited weapons, but you had to get a tax stamp. Now, originally, getting that tax stamp wasn't too difficult, but everybody knows that when something first starts and it's not too difficult, it gets a whole lot harder later. Now, the National Firearms Act from the 30s went ahead and prohibited machine guns, which we know, if we're sensible about it, is a weapon that will fire multiple times with one pull of the trigger. It's not an assault weapon where you have to actually manipulate the trigger a number of times, once for each round, but it is a fully automatic weapon that has multiple rounds per trigger pull. It also prohibited short-barreled shotguns, short-barreled rifles, a number of other military things. And this is basically because of, as I said, those criminals that went from bank to bank in their fast cars, shooting everything up and throwing hand grenades, literally. Now, that particular piece of legislation, the National Firearms Act, has been amended a lot. But it really wasn't amended or added to much until we get to 1968. And in 1968, if you recall from history, or perhaps you were alive at the time I was, the president was shot. He was assassinated in Texas. And he was assassinated by one man with a Mannlicher Carcano. And he got that weapon through the mail. Well, up until that point, there hadn't been a licensing system for dealers. The 1968 Firearms Act created the licensing system for dealers, creating a whole bunch of prohibited people. It prohibited mail transfer or sales of guns. You couldn't buy mail order anymore. And really, up to that point, you could write in to any company, and they would, you pay them, and they'd send you a gun. Wasn't a big deal. I grew up with older people who told me that was how you got guns. You just bought them. After that, we come to the 1994 assault weapons ban. Now, the assault weapons ban was purely political, in my opinion, and it pretty much outlawed guns that people thought looked like they were dangerous. Because for anyone with any sense or information about firearms, all firearms are dangerous. And all firearms can be used as assault weapons, if you want to talk about it that way. It's the nature of the beast. That had something that was rare, and it was the only real effect that if you what's called the Republican or the conservative part of the legislature did it had a sunset provision. And that sunset provision required it to be reenacted in 10 years. Now, including with the assault weapons ban was a ban on high-capacity magazines, so you couldn't have any more than 10 rounds in a magazine of any weapon that had a detachable magazine. If you had a tubular magazine weapon, you could have 11, 12, however you want in it, but as long as it wasn't detachable. Well, that expired in 2004, thankfully, from those people who care about our Second Amendment rights. Following that, we had, or actually preceding the expiration by 1 year in 2003, we had the Importation Act, Firearms and Military Weapons Importation Act. Now, that is a tremendous amount of regulation, which is so nitpicky that trying to read it and make sense out of it is a trial for anyone, including attorneys who had some experience. I've read it. It is absolutely the most nitpicking thing. But what comes of it is that a bunch of firearms that people didn't like in Washington, D.C. and on the coast were prohibited from being imported into the United States, regardless of whether or not they were machine guns or not. And then there were also places you couldn't export weapons to. Now, as far as most people are concerned, the second one isn't important, because there are places like North Korea and other countries that are not favored by our regulatory state. But the thing that's important for us as people who would like to own firearms is that if there is an imported firearm, and you had to have this list of features that it had to either have or not have in order to be importable. Things like a flash suppressor or a bayonet lug on the front of it, or did it have a hand grip, or was it a detachable magazine semi-automatic weapon or something like that. And each firearm to be qualified for importation had to have below so many points, because you got a point for like having a pistol grip on a rifle. You got some points for that, you got some points for a bayonet lug, you got some points for some other stuff. And what's important for citizens is that if you change that after it's imported, it's a crime. And that really is amazing, because how do you know? You don't. You don't know if you add a pistol grip to a gun, are you now increasing its points above its importable range, and so you have committed a federal felony. And I always have to think that whenever the regulatory state does this, they must do this to the purpose of making sure that there is something that you have done in your life that they can arrest you for. It's handy. It's handy to have a handle on somebody so that if you need to, you can reach out and grab them. Now, the advantage to the citizenry for us is that there are so many of us. And the regulatory state is, by its nature, inefficient and incompetent. But that's kind of a small, reassurance. It makes you kind of sit there and say, is this right or is this not? Should I let other people see it or not? Am I going to give it to the wrong person at a range and they're going to say, oh, this is in violation, and next thing you know, the ATF is on you. There is the Lautenberg Amendment. This was passed in 1996. Now, the Lautenberg Amendment was for a laudable purpose, one would like to think, but then most of the roads to hell are paved with good intention. The Lautenberg Amendment says that if you have committed an act of domestic violence and been convicted of it, or you are subject to an order of protection, then you cannot possess any firearm. In some places, this is not really a big deal because the police officers in the area don't do anything about it. In other places, including Missouri, there's a mechanism that does anybody here know what an order of protection is? Yeah, we got some and some, and we got who say no. Well, basically what it is, if you are in a relationship with someone and that person commits an act of violence against you, threatens you, you can go to a judge and you can get an order that says, if this person does that again or is around you at all, they can be arrested. That's called an order of protection. Now, one good thing about the Lautenberg Amendment is that it requires there to be a hearing. And most of these orders of protection are done in a judge's office, where you aren't there. Somebody can come in and lie about you, and you get this order of protection, and all of a sudden, a sheriff's at your door saying, you can't go around so-and-so because they said that you threatened them and hit them. Luckily, the firearms prohibition doesn't go into effect until you are at a hearing where you had an opportunity to appear in front of the judge and can be heard. Now, those hearings often are summary, and you don't have an attorney. I will tell you, if you want to own firearms in any state in the United States, and you are ever the subject of an order of protection, and you are in front of a judge in court with the other party and maybe an attorney, but nonetheless, in front of a judge, that's a hearing, and anything that happens there can destroy your right to carry or have a firearm until the order expires. So don't say it's okay with me. I have to tell you, you need an attorney if you want to maintain your God-given right to have firearms. Now, if there are any atheists here, I'm sorry to use God-given right. I'm a natural rights kind of guy and a Catholic soul. For me, it's God-given rights. Okay. Nonetheless, if you want to have that right recognized by the regulatory state, you've got to defend yourself, and you need an attorney. And don't agree, and don't let that pass. Now, there was also the Brady Bill in 1993, and that was occasioned by another attempted assassination of a president, where Ronald Reagan was shot by John Hinckley. And there were a number of things in the Brady Bill, but the biggest thing about it was the instant check. That came around, the background check. Now, that seems to be not too big an imposition on folks, except for the fact that it's the regulatory state telling you that you have to have their permission to buy a firearm, which is insulting just by its very nature. But it, as other good-intentioned things, has a lot of problems. And one of which is that, other than its mere existence, is the fact that if you have a common name, like Smith, or Johnson, or Brown, or any one of a number of common names, and they run an instant check on you, boy, you're going to get all kinds of false hits. Even if you've never done anything in your life. Or should I probably say never got caught doing anything in your life. But you're going to have a problem buying a firearm. And once they say, no, we've got a problem with you firing a firearm, it's on you. Now, just about, 2 weeks ago, it was announced that the Obama administration has removed all funds for the Department of Justice to do appeals on NICS checks denials. So the regulatory state then says, okay, we're going to deny you, and because we don't have money, we're not going to go ahead and let you appeal. Yes, sir?
That's also a de facto registration that nobody wants to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
If people would like to ask questions, we have a microphone up there. This is going to go on YouTube, so...
Yeah, and the gentleman asked a question, or I made a statement, that it's a de facto registration. That actually is technically not true, but practically probably true. And I'll explain it this way. They're supposed to destroy the records of all NICS checks. The system is designed and is supposed to purge them. Does anybody here believe that the regulatory state is going to purge records that it's gathered about anything?
Actually, 10 days ago, it was shown that it hasn't happened, and they have at least 12 years worth of records.
Right, and to put this on our tape here, the gentleman said 10 days ago that there's evidence that they have 12 years. Yeah, I have never even assumed that they were going to do that. I've always assumed that the National Security Administration keeps everything that it can gather in, and this is just too easy. It's low-hanging fruit. There's a computer system. The computer system is supposed to be purged. I'm sure the information is recorded, and it's purged after it's been recorded and put in some other system. I'm pretty sure about that. Now then, what's the kind of good news? Well, the good news, of course, is Washington, D.C. versus Heller. And most everybody here knows about Heller, right? It's the court case that said you actually do have a United States constitutionally recognized right to possess firearms. Now, that was a really cool thing to have happen. Unfortunately, it's in the detail stage, and the cases are all over the map. There are places where you still can't carry concealed weapons because of the arguments of the regulatory sub-state, the state or city, that find well-meaning judges, at least well-meaning for them, and they go ahead and say Heller doesn't apply. It was applied in Chicago, so Chicago has to have a system to be able to have people carry or possess firearms. It's not been applied in a lot of other situations. There are still cases pending about assault rifle bans and other kinds of things. So I can't really tell you too much about the details of what Heller's effect is, because it really is all over the board right now. And it'll take 10 years and a couple of other trips to the Supreme Court for the details and how far Heller's going to be carried. Now, I'm almost about done, and I'd like to talk about something that I think is very interesting, and that's additive manufacturing, 3D printing. 3D printing is going to revolutionize a lot of our lives. Right now, we are in the infancy of 3D printing, both in materials that can be printed and methods that can be used to print it. There have been some very nice attempts to create firearms using 3D printing. And that's, for people who are worried about having the state regulate things, that moves the method of manufacture much closer to the consumer. Now, it's great for a lot of other things. I think what's going to happen is you're going to have people 3D print shoes for you. Go in and get your foot measured individually, and you'll have your own shoes 3D printed. Okay. They'll have other kind of manufacturing. But I think they're also going to be figuring out how to manufacture firearms that way. And that's going to drive the regulatory state crazy. I am sure that, and I think this is already going on in Europe, that those kinds of high-tech, high-capability printers are starting to get licensed. We know the first time you pay a license is the admission that you no longer have control over that item. I am kind of optimistic in the sense that it's the genie that's going to struggle out of the bottle no matter what. You're just not going to be able to keep technology down. It's digital information. You can't really keep people from exchanging digital information on the internet and using it. So as far as the federal regulations of firearms rights go, I think it's ultimately going to get lost. I also think it's ultimately going to get lost for another reason. And we can give kudos to President Obama for this. People are so afraid of President Obama doing something to curtail their natural rights to defend themselves, to have firearms to do that, is that they've just made a lot of firearms companies really profitable. There are more firearms purchased in Obama's administration than probably was purchased in the 3 or 4 administrations before that. There are a whole lot of American firearms manufacturing companies that have popped into existence that are using a lot of very nice technology to make it inexpensive to own firearms. And right now, I think that the current estimate is that there's probably a firearm for every man, woman, and child in the United States. But, you know, we can laugh about, Donald Trump's argument and his plan to expel all Mexican illegals. But there are only about 11 million of them, and they're big. I mean, they are real tough to hide. Now, we all think that's not a very reasonable solution, and not only is it not a reasonable solution, it's not a workable solution. How are you going to manage it? The logistics of it would be crazy. I think the logistics of trying to prohibit firearms to people in the United States is equally logistically crazy. The state of New York right now has, 2 years ago, they passed an assault weapons ban, 2.5 years ago, something like that. Well, right now, the estimate, the official estimate is that they got about 30%. The unofficial estimate is that they probably got about 10% of those firearms turned in or moved out of the state. There's a boatload of assault rifles in the state of New York that are buried, stuck in closets, attics, wherever. People are just not going to do it. And that's the same thing that Canada found out when it tried its firearms registry. They spent literally $1 billion trying to register Canadian firearms. They finally gave up and closed their registry down because it just didn't work. We kind of laugh at Canadians because they tend to be very compliant to regulatory states, but in this case they weren't because it really wasn't reasonable. Now, I've kind of talked about everything I wanted to talk about. Is there anybody that has questions? And I will tell you flat out that I'm not a complete expert about firearms law. I know experts about firearms law. They're better than I am. But I might have some information if you've got a question. So the microphone's right out here. Anybody wants to ask a question, or I'll go ahead and ask a question and I'll repeat it for the podcast. No? No. Thank you.
I do have a comment, though.
Okay, come on up.
I think it was in Connecticut a couple of years back. They tried to pass one of these bans or registration, or I think it was registration. And at the deadline, almost nobody in the entire state had complied with the law. And something like 1/3 of the residents of Connecticut were felons at that point. And the government was like, what do we do? And I'm not sure exactly what happened with that. So maybe, are you familiar with that? You know what happened?
I think the law's still on the book.
Okay.
And because that's a lot of what the government does when they have a law that nobody cares about, they still keep it on the books. A good example is marijuana. Okay, we're libertarians, anarchists, and voluntarists here, and we all think that the prohibition of marijuana is stupid. Okay. I was a police officer and a prosecutor, and I came to the conclusion that it was stupid. And it just wasn't doing anybody any good. Well, now we have the federal government, they still prohibit marijuana. It's still a federal offense to have it under particular conditions, and it's not as easy to get arrested and convicted by the federal government for the possession of marijuana than in the states. But they're ignoring it in those states which make it legal, right? They aren't prosecuting anybody in Colorado. Why? Because the people don't want it. And sooner or later, it's going to get through their big heads. It'll take a while, and it'll take money because they're going to tax it. We all know that. The only reason why they're ever going to make anything legal is so they can tax it. But it'll take a while for them to figure it out. Now, since there aren't any more questions or comments, I'm going to end with one last thing. I'd like you to think about weapons and firearms with respect to all the regulatory powers, the states, the cities, the counties, the federal government. I want you to think of it like this, because it helps to get it in your head, how they feel about them. Think of them as contraband, which is regrettably legal. And if you think of it that way, then you'll understand why it is they do the things they do. Because, yes, it's legal, but they don't want it to be. Thank you very much.